All right, let's see. Basically, I know like people are used to like really polished presentations where people kind of like have their shtick down and everything. And the problem is, I just spent like 3 days in a car with my dogs driving here from Colorado, and they're not really good conversationalists. So you just start running these tracks in your head, and you start thinking about all these things. And so when I stand up, I just have this spew that just wants to like come out because it's all been pent up over the last 3 days in this car. And it was a great drive. And basically, the other issue that I have is I feel like, I mean, literally since the 1st of September, I've just been on the road doing stand-up. And I'm just like pooped on the one hand. And on the other hand, I can't tell you how just like pumped and excited I am about all this stuff, right? Because there is just so much happening all over the world around all of these same issues that it's really stunning. And I think it's a real reflection about how much traction this stuff is really getting. And it's also, I think, really, really easy to lose perspective on what it is that this is all about fundamentally. For me, I think I first started like confronting this dissonance in my own life when I was teaching at Harvard and living in San Francisco and commuting to Boston on a regular basis to teach, right? And I found myself like in the jet looking out the window at the Rockies and the desert and all this stuff for the first third of my flight, and then the last 2/3 from like the Front Range into Boston, I'd do emails and I'd read and I'd do all this kind of stuff, right? And my whole shtick is about like value, right? The full nature of value and how to maximize that through our organizations and our capital and our lives and our communities and blah. And I had to kind of confront this reality that in my own life I had this major disconnect, right, between like what I was doing and how I was living and what I was talking about and writing about and promoting as a practice. So I resigned my appointment at Harvard, which was kind of a funny conversation to have because you got the feeling they don't have that conversation very often. And I basically decided I wanted to go hike, and I wanted to just get out and get away from a lot of that. And so about 5 years ago, I started living half-time in the Rockies, and then about 1.5 years ago, I sold my house here in San Francisco, and now all I do is just kind of like work there. And basically, I think it's important to understand what perspective consists of, right? And I'm sure that I haven't really done a lot of major research on any of this or anything like that, but just off the top of my head, I'm thinking that perspective is basically a function of where you're kind of from, where you've been, and how you understand where you're going, right? And you put those three elements together, and that places you in a certain kind of point in time with a sense of what is, okay? And my perspective of what is just getting like whipsawed all over the place these days. Because simultaneously, this is basically Shadow Mountain Lake, looking up into the park, and that's Mount Ida. This is where I walk my dogs like every afternoon, okay? And it's just great. It's like a really great place to be. And it's been a really interesting thing because I do, as Tracy was saying, I sit there in the morning and I'll have like a 3-hour conference call with somebody in like Geneva and somebody in South Africa and somebody else there about like, structuring capital in order to drive multiple returns or something like that. And then you walk out the back door and there's like a bull moose standing there looking at you. And you're kind of like, man, this is just like phenomenal how this is all happening. So where I've been, as Tracy kind of alluded to, I have this really kind of weird thing where my background is basically in social work. And I think of myself as a social worker whose career has just gone horribly astray, basically. It's just kind of my problem. And so I had this whole kind of social work career track that ran through my 30s. And I reached this point where I kind of, having been the founding director of Larkin Street Youth Center, I kind of woke up and I realized that I was this tool in the poverty industry, right? That my job as a social worker wasn't actually to change anything. It was really to kind of provide services and keep poor people like content, And there was just some dissonance for me in that, in terms of that I actually like wanted to do something, right, and thought that's what this was all about. And so I did a lateral ejection on my career track, and through some weird kind of connections, ended up working with George Roberts of KKR, the founding partner of KKR, and basically started doing all this stuff around, well, what would it look like, and this is like 89, 90, what would it look like to take business acumen and practice and technique and try to drive a community or social agenda with that through leveraging philanthropic capital into market-based enterprises that were run by nonprofit organizations to employ homeless people, right? So you're talking like fundamentally like right in the middle of this rip. And so that set off a whole bunch of other things we could talk about. And and then again, I kind of got to this stage where I ended up writing about this stuff because George and I were in this meeting about 5 years into this thing. This guy put like $7 million into this initiative. And we're talking about this, and he was like, well, you know, I know the names of some of these business managers. I see that we're doing good things. This is really a great initiative. Everybody tells me this is really great, but I just don't really know, like, what is this that we're really doing? Like, what do we really have here, right? And it occurred to me, I was thinking, Jesus, I mean, this guy spent $7 million. He doesn't know what he bought. Right? This is a problem for me as the head of this thing, right? And so we basically stepped back, and we took about 6 months, and we wrote a book, a 417-page book called The New Social Entrepreneur that we released online in hard copy in '96. They kind of teed up a lot of this thinking around this stuff. And so as you had the tech folks come on board in the late 90s with all their kind of like, well, we created a revolution in technology, and now we're going to create a revolution in education, right? And so they all kind of weighed in. And it was really easy to look good then because there wasn't that much that had been written at that point. So it's kind of like the fact that you're using these words and language and tools, you kind of stood out. And so that's how I ended up at Harvard, because they wanted me to come and teach and do more writing and things like that. And then I left that, and Stanford was like, well, the commute from San Francisco to Palo Alto is a lot better than the commute from San Francisco to Boston. So would you come on board there? And so I ended up doing more of the stuff, but simply like as an academic, kind of accidental academic, because I don't have a PhD. I'm not really on any kind of a tenure track. I don't really care about the academy. But I think that the trick is there's knowledge and there's experience and there's learning that's evolving and morphing out. And we're not doing a good enough job tracking that and communicating it and actually kind of failing forward. I see a lot of people kind of like replicating other people's mistakes, that if they would just like stop and integrate some of the knowledge that's already out there, we could do a lot better. But in any event, and so this is kind of where I'm at. So I'm trying to figure out for myself, how do you put all this stuff together? How do you understand conceptually what the nature of value fundamentally is about? How do you look at the world then and drive that insight into institutions that really at their core are having problems maximizing their full value potential? Right? And then how do you think about the capital that sits on the other side of those institutions, and how you structure various types of capital? And this is kind of like what we'll go into, but that's kind of like where I am right now. But ultimately, what I'm really interested in, is this going to come up? Come on, baby. There we go. Is this. Because at the end of the day, this is basically from the Hubble Space Telescope. This is like some sort of cosmic dust cloud or something like that. And but I think it's really, really important that we just kind of pause, right, and think about the fact that this is really where we all came from. Right? Everything here, okay, our energy, this, everything comes from the stars. Right? And ultimately, whatever your kind of personal spiritual beliefs may be, this is kind of also where we're going to return. And everything in between is just like, like how you are and what you did and the legacy that you leave, and how we think about that. And for me, I really kind of reached a point where, you can start X number of businesses, and you can start so many organizations, and you can promote your career, and you can be interviewed, and you can have all this stuff that kind of shows that you lived. But at the end of the day, in your own gut, if you're not really, really connected to fundamentally what is the basic core value that you're trying to create and maximize in all parts of your life, none of that stuff is worth anything. And that's more kind of like what I'm kind of grappling with. And so when I was thinking about coming and talking at the Net Impact event, this is the issue that I think we need to keep in mind, because it's so easy to get into the career track and to get committed to certain agendas, and you get kind of like bought into the process. And sometimes you just need to remember that the career and the organizations and all that stuff is great, but at the end of the day, you got to, as Al was saying, be really, really keyed in on your core value that you're trying to create. And so that's kind of why I've kind of taken this sideways cut on this presentation, is that I want to talk about the nature of value, I want to talk about capital, I want to talk about organizations, but at the end of the day, the reason that we're doing this is because we're all kind of like part of this parade. And I think that we all are in different parts of the parade, carrying different banners and things, but at the end of the day, it's not about the part of the parade or how we identify, it's about the movement forward and about what we represent and create through the process of our having lived. So when we think about value, what we usually do is kind of approach it like this, right? And so you got your standard kind of economic value thing, and you got your social, environmental value thing going that way. And we in essence, have bought into this idea that you can have like for-profits up here, organizationally, and you can have non-profits down there. And you can have foundations down here in terms of asset management and capital providers, and you can have investment banking institutions up there. And so what we've done is created, along this kind of investment plane, if you will, that runs from here to there, these sets of institutions and organizations and instruments. So you have grants down there, you have maybe program-related investing here, you have full market rate investing up there. And this understanding of value has actually worked pretty well for most of the people in the game, right? It's created phenomenal wealth for a lot of folks. It's done really good. My whole career has been spent somewhere along this plane, and I would bet that most of yours has been spent there as well. And the problem, though, is that it's fundamentally the wrong way to think about value. Right? It's just wrong. Okay? There's nothing right about this bifurcation, because at the end of the day, you cannot disaggregate value. You cannot take value and pull it apart and say that as a business person you can rape, pillage, and philanthropy, and somehow that's okay. Right? That you can somehow take your grant dollars and do good because you did so bad when you were making your economic value over here. Right? As a nonprofit, it's not good enough to say, well, we raised a lot of money, we gave a lot of money away, we did a lot of charity. Because it's not about charity. It's not about social impact. It's about leverage and maximum full value impact. And that's the issue. And as you'll see, as I kind of dissect this, I have major issues around how foundations are managed and how nonprofits are run on just this point. Because at the end of the day, the value really resides up here. It's fully integrated. It's fully embedded in itself. You can't tease it apart. It's really, as this graph so clearly illustrates, it's really, it's really in this quadrant. This is actually from the paper that I did when I was at HBS, so it's a little like bent in terms of the jargon and stuff. But the basic idea is that you have social and you have economic that are fundamentally like reinforcing each other like this, and then all that takes place within this sheath of environmental value that you can't pull yourself out of. Right? So, like your mom knew this stuff. Okay? I mean, when she used to like send you off to school and she'd have you out at the door and you have your little backpack and everything, you'd be all ready to go. She didn't lean down over you and say, "No, I want you to be the richest little venture capitalist you can be." Right? She didn't say that. She said, take care of your allowance, don't beat up your sister, and when you get home, walk the dog. Right? So mom knew. Okay? Be smart in terms of how you manage your economic assets and value. Don't beat up your sister. You're part of a social context and contract. And you need to provide for others in the same way that you provide for yourself. And walk the dog. Obviously, take care of the planet. Don't do this kind of thing. Don't ruin things. And so I think, going back to Al's comment this morning about the the light spectrum, I think of it in terms of value. Right? And value is fundamentally whole. It's like the white light that comes and hits the prism. And then it goes like, and there's all kind of ways that you can think about it. But the way that we tend to think about it in current kind of conceptual framing is like right here. It's only that stuff that we can actually document and track, because we've convinced ourselves that if we can document and track it, somehow we can manage it, right? You can't manage what you can't measure, right? Bullshit. Okay? I just don't believe that for a minute. We can take that last line out of there probably. But and I think nobody doubts that microwaves exist, right? Ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma, all this stuff is fundamentally there. When you're a business manager and you launch an enterprise, you're creating, great economic value. You're also employing people, you're paying taxes, you're taking resources out of the planet and hopefully not just, putting waste back in. There's a whole set of value implications for what you're doing that never are represented on the balance sheet or your cash flow statement or any of these things, because we believe in this thing called externalities, right? So as a business, you can set up your books and you can do all this stuff, and half the value, more than half the value, I would argue, that you're actually engaged in creating and managing never represents itself on your balance sheets or any of the metrics that we use traditionally. Something is wrong with that equation. This is I actually stole this from John Elkington, who does the triple bottom line work, and it's from Shell, from one of their annual reports a couple of years ago. And I think it's really interesting because what they're saying in this report is that the value that we're creating as a company is not even a function of the triple bottom line. It's a function of how those elements interact over time to create the full value of the firm. That's the blended value proposition. And it's interesting to watch how it's kind of morphing out into a lot of these ways. And it's not so much, it's Jed's language, and I'm trying to convince people that this is the way to think about this.
It's fundamentally what is happening out there. Right? I don't have to do anything. This is the great thing about my job. All you have to do is sit back and watch these processes evolve and help people kind of connect the dots, because it's really happening out there right now today. And it has a lot of implications. It has implications for how we think about the role of the fiduciary. And in this context, I have another paper that is going up on the Generation website in a couple weeks on fiduciary trustees and being a responsible trustee and what that means. But in this context, I'm really thinking of it as some kind of integration of financial and lifetime fiduciary, because I think the way that you think about how you manage your life assets is as important as the way trustees think about how they manage financial assets. And we need to just recognize that. It has implications for how we organize our work. It has implications for how we think about the nature of the firm. It has implications for capital tracking. You can read all that stuff yourself. In terms of the fiduciary responsibility piece, if you're managing assets for long-term value, right, you have to think about those assets differently than if you just manage them for a short-term kind of in-and-out performance. And if you think about your life, I would argue that you have to think about managing your life for that long-term piece. The great job that you can get today that really jeopardizes what it is that you in your gut really want to do and feel called to do isn't really such a great job. Okay? Even if in terms of your career track and what it is that your profession or whatever says that you should be doing, it's a great job. And I personally had to deal with this a year ago when I was approached by a guy who's like a famous tech guy, and he was like, look, I'm going to operationalize all this stuff. We're going to do a fully unified investment strategy. We're going to take our philanthropy, our mainstream investing, and our new business development, and we're going to manage it all as one initiative around value creation, right? And we want you to come and work on this with us and help us kind of do this, right? This is it. The guy's giving me like the keys to the kingdom, right? And I was like, well, okay, but I need to be able to work out of Colorado part-time, right? Because I have this other thing going, right? And I'm trying to get integration, right? I want to get this whole thing together. And he couldn't do it, right? And I had to walk from that job without generation or anything else on the back end. And it scared the hell out of me. It really did. Because here I am, I'm living up in the high country, no visible means of support. And I'm kind of like, oh my God, how could I do this, right? And as I thought about it, how could I do this, right? There's just no way. Because it would have put me right back on that track of having this phenomenal career path and a really crummy personal life. And quite frankly, it just ain't worth it. It's just not worth it. But in any event, so managing your resources and your assets for the long-term piece and understanding that the value that gets created is, again, this integration of kind of like the value of the firm and the capital, but also the personal investment that you're putting into that. And that you need to be managing that over time. Because what will happen is you get into these companies and these firms, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, and it's really, again, a matter of understanding that the point is not necessarily to maximize financial or social value, but from a value creation perspective, the whole idea of nonprofit and for-profit really doesn't matter. Right? Because nonprofits create economic value and worth, and for-profits have social and environmental impacts and value as well. And so the question is really, how do you help each type of institution, whatever kind of legal or institutional structure it finds itself within, how do you help that institution maximize the full value potential that it has? One of the things that I think about is the affordable housing industry in this country, where 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we had, and I would argue we still have, major issues around affordable, low-cost housing. And so we created the Affordable Housing Tax Credit, and all these community development corporations came into being, using that as a financing mechanism to build all this affordable housing in the United States. And that's a great track record of success. I take nothing away from the affordable housing community. The problem I have is most of that housing was built with clear-cut lumber. Right? So here are these folks who say, we care about community, we care about people, we're good people, right? We're the good guys, we're the social housing people and stuff, right? And yet, what they're doing is, in their pursuit of their pure social mission, they're creating a disevaluation in terms of environmental impacts. Right? All they had to do was not think of themselves in the social work or the social kind of framework, but think of themselves as value creators. And they could have gone to the timber industry and said, look, we've just created this whole new financing mechanism that's going to create a whole new market for your products. And what we want to do is contract with you guys to provide sustainably harvested timber for these products. And that's how we're going to drive this. And you could combine the economic value potential that those institutions had with the social impacts that they have created and create greater in the aggregate value than they have, I would argue, by doing one or the other. And I think that there are examples like that just straight down the line in terms of how we think about value in these organizations. And the point is that, again, the focus shouldn't really be on whether you're nonprofit or for-profit. The focus needs to be on how you maximize the impact of the potentially relationships in order to have the greatest value creation potential that you can. So on the flip side of that, then, you've got these organizations and institutions. You also then have the capital markets that are kind of driving some of this performance in a not insignificant way. And I think that in the past, we've seen, really this kind of, the breakout, the bifurcation of the value piece where you make money here and you give it away over there. And increasingly, you're seeing that getting called into question. You're seeing people who are really saying that, in fact, you can take economic instruments, you can take investing instruments, and you can create social and environmental value as well as financial performance in return. And the issue is more one of how do you structure that? How do you play in this middle space? Now, in another shtick I do, I've got this whole thing where I break down all these different examples of blended value investing, which is like this space in between kind of pure philanthropic and pure market rate investing practices. And I don't want to go through that now, but just to say that not only in the United States, but around the world, more and more investor groups are coming together to do this, to actually engage in this practice where they want to see effective application of their financial resources and assets in the same way that, at the same time that they're actually creating social and environmental value. And I'm just going to take a second and kind of blow through a couple of these so you have some idea. But one of them is the Acumen Fund, which actually started out, they still receive philanthropic support, but they started out making grants to organizations that were doing different things on a kind of an enterprise basis. And they've now moved through loans, and now they're doing almost pure equity plays with these organizations. And an example of that is Seacom in Egypt, which is basically a cooperative of organic farmers. And their investment, they did a $350,000 investment that was a combination, kind of a blended structure instrument of loan and equity that allowed them to expand from 426 to 860. They have an annual growth rate this past year that obviously is not itself sustainable, but they did 35% growth over that time. And they were able to, again, create real value here. Now, my question is, what kind of value is this? Right? I mean, it's fundamentally, it's real economic value. These people are making money. They're growing into new markets. They're getting a financial return for their participants in the cooperative. They are, by definition, creating environmental value because they're basically teaching people how to do organic agriculture. So that's of worth and has value. And they're also then having a direct effect on the families that are part of these cooperative structures. Right? So you tell me, right? I mean, it's kind of like this is the issue in terms of how we think about the nature of value when it comes to capital. Think about Shorebank Pacific, who are basically FDIC insured, sustainable banking institution, offers CDs, money markets, savings accounts. I mean, very traditional kind of instruments and offerings for folks. As a foundation, if you buy CDs from Shorebank and you opt to take a below market rate of return, you get PRI credit for that. So it counts toward your social mission as well as how you manage your assets. And then what they do is they take these resources and they re-lend them on the regional basis to support sustainable business development in the Northwest. What kind of value is that? I mean, it's full blended value. Finally, Merrill Lynch Community Development Corporation, $800 million in CDC-type lending and equity. Their performance as a fund, 0 losses on their loans, and less than 1% of equity is performed on a subpar basis. Right? So that's pretty good. And they're basically returning that investment back to they're returning that financial return to their investor group. So that's one whole set of players in the capital space. A lot of my work has been around the foundation community and really beating these people up. Because if you think about the way that most foundations are managed, it really doesn't make any sense. Most foundation people think of themselves as grant makers. They think our job is to provide grants to the nonprofit sector. So what they do is they manage their corpus so it can have that payout. And most foundations try to drive for a 5% payout because that's the regulated piece, and they don't really do much more above that, although they can certainly opt to do that if they want to. The problem I have with that is twofold. One is that if you look at capital flows in the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic community represents less than 2 to 3% of the total capital flows in the sector. So the idea that the foundation community is going to have a significant impact through its grant making just doesn't make any sense to me, because they're not even really a major player in terms of how money actually moves through that space. If they really want to have an impact, they need to think about their assets in a different way. They need to think about the intellectual assets they bring to the table. They can think about how they can help build a field of practice. They can think about lobbying and other activities in terms of public policy. They can think about the whole transparency and engagement with the field and really modeling different practices. And obviously, they can think about their grant making in a more effective, strategic way. The other problem I have with the foundation community is that as a quasi kind of business investment kind of guy, it makes no sense to me that you would create an institution that takes 5% of its assets to drive 100% of its mission and keeps 95% of its assets to pursue nothing, right? At best, you're neutral, and at worst, you may actually be investing on the 95% in creating and contributing to the problems that you claim to be concerned about addressing with your 5%. And I just think it's fundamentally wrong. It's a wrong way to think about asset management, and it's the wrong way to think about value creation. For me, I think one of the better examples was the Nathan Cummings Foundation, which is a great organization, great people. Right? Carolyn Williams, who was their treasurer, was getting ready for a board meeting, and she was going to report into the board on the whole set of investments they were making, and was also going to report in on some of the grants that were under consideration. And she was looking at like the two reports, and she saw that they had a $875,000 investment that they were making at Smithfield Foods, which is a great ag-con business, does great returns and all that stuff. Happens to engage in a lot of hog farming in the Midwest. Very good group. And then she looked on the grant sheet, and they were making an $800,000 grant to a nonprofit in the Midwest to address the negative effects of hog farming. Right? And it's kind of like, at the end of the day, something's wrong here, kids. Right? Now, what they decided to do is we're not going to do any of this negative screening. We're going to actually make the investment and use the relationship, the shareholder relationship, to engage management and try to work with them around how to affect their supply chain so that there is better practices all the way along. So there's a lot of different answers, and I'm not arguing that there's one way to go with any of this. Right? All I'm arguing is that if you're really managing for value and you have assets under management, whether your own life assets or fiscal assets or whatever it is, you need to think in terms of how do you maximize the full impact. And so from a foundation perspective, all I'm asking for is a unified investment strategy that basically says when we think about the grants that we're making, and these grants each carry like higher levels of social risk, if you will, for the type of grant that you're actually engaged in providing, but we think about those in concert with how we're allocating the rest of our assets. And the actual instruments that you're going to be in, the overall strategy and risk exposure you're going to carry, I mean, all that is going to look different for different foundations in the same way that for any investor. Depending on your risk tolerance and what you're actually trying to do, you're going to create a portfolio that reflects what it is that you think will get you to the end goal. But the main thing is that it has to be a unified approach. We have to think about this in that way, which raises a whole set of issues in terms of how we understand tracking and performance in the metrics themselves. Because we fundamentally have this problem where we've got this kind of, we do evaluation on the social stuff over here. We have FROI, financial analysis, econometrics over here. And the problem is we don't really have a good way to talk about this middle space or to really drive managers to perform in non-economic or extra economic, I guess you could say, performance. And the thing that I have with this one is that, I mean, I think it's great, again, what people have done in terms of double and triple bottom line work and the reporting practices and all that. The problem is that most of that doesn't get reintegrated. Right? So when you release a triple bottom line report, the social and environmental people all flip to the section that has like the social and environmental elements. And the finance people all turn to the metrics that are like numeric. Okay? And again, my issue is that there is a single non-divisible bottom line. And we need to be taking forward a set of, first a framework, and then a set of metrics that allow us to actually track performance over time and understand that increasingly what's happening is that in the corporate community, a lot of this stuff started out simply as compliance stuff that they did for stakeholders, rather. Right? So they were getting beat up about, you know, you're doing this in this forest, or you're doing this in terms of how you treat your employees. And so they started just reporting out to people externally. But the problem was none of the managers are driving any of that into the internal operations of the company and shifting how they actually make decisions in terms of how they manage their firm. And increasingly what I think is happening is both, and for the nonprofit variation of that, you had outcome funding, where basically you would start spewing all of this data for foundations and governmental entities, but you would never really use that to inform how you develop your own program or operations in the nonprofit context. And I think what's happening is that increasingly you're seeing both nonprofit and for-profit managers kind of saying, you know, if we can tweak this stuff and drive it down into actually how we run a company, we can actually do something different here. We can use it to inform how we manage and how we make decisions in the course of the work that we're engaged in. And so, which this raises then this whole set of issues around how we understand knowledge. Because what's happening is the best and emerging promising practice the stuff that's the best is not coming from any of the silos. It's not coming from the nonprofit side and the social advocates, and it's not coming from the business schools and the academics or the business managers. It's coming when you have like a business person who bumps into a social person, and they start talking about like what they're doing, and they're kind of like, geez, this is really kind of similar. Right? When you talk to, I mean, for me, this really got driven home when I was in a meeting with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in D.C., and I'm talking to these white guys in suits, and they were just all white guys in suits. It was classic, right? But I'm talking to these guys, and they were saying like, well, we think that fundamentally, that mainstream corporations create social value for society, and we don't feel that we're getting adequately credited for that value creation, right? And then you go down the street and you talk to the CDC community, and they're like, we're creating economic and social value, and we're always viewed as just asking for a handout, right? And it's fundamentally, they're both grappling with the same issue and the same shortfall, and where they connect is in the dysfunctionality of the existing frameworks and practice. So what's happening is that the new knowledge that's going to come forward comes as you have folks who can simultaneously occupy multiple spaces in these networks. And it comes out through the creation of these kind of value networks where people connect by trying to explore common problems and challenges and issues that they're having in the course of their work. And so it's the value networks that transcend these silos that really is where the action is going to be over the coming years. And it's really where the action is right now. You see it in terms of different internet-based collaboratives that people are engaged in to try to solve some of these problems, whether from a capital or from an organizational management piece. And again, bring this back to the personal journey kind of stuff. I mean, it's like this is really where the action is for each of us as individuals, right? I mean, increasingly, you see business people who cash out at 40, 50, 60 and go into the nonprofit sector. You see nonprofit people who go back and get an MBA because they want to engage in community good and social value creation. I mean, people are like morphing back and forth all the time in this stuff, and we need to have more confidence in that journey and in the fact that that morphing personally is what will lead to community value and corporate value over time, because that's really where the action is. And quite frankly, it's just a lot more fun than sitting in one little slot your entire life, like folks often did in the past. So about 3 years ago, a group of us started talking about this issue, and we started thinking in terms of these silos. And with support from CERDNA and from Hewlett and Skoll and Packard, a couple of other folks, we were able to basically do this convening process. And what we said was, okay, if you're in one of these silos and you want to drop into the other silo, how would you know what's going on in that space? And so we brought people together from these 5 areas, and we basically said to them, all right, what are the key topics, resources, resource organizations, initiative, leadership examples, and issues under discussion within your silo? And how would you define that? Who do you point to when you try to tell somebody about what it is you do, that kind of thing. So we put all that together into one kind of map thing. But then what we said was, what we're really interested in, though, is this. Like, what are the challenges and the issues that are holding you back? And what we found was that, in fact, if you look at these silos, they're all talking about issues of capital. They're talking about issues of performance measurement and metric. They're talking about how do you create an enabling environment that can help us move this forward. I mean, they're all talking about the same thing. So on the one hand, this is all really, really great, right? As you tell, I get kind of excited about it. On the other hand, it's really frustrating because most of these people still think of themselves as here, and they don't think of themselves as here, much less going out here to create the maximum value that they potentially could. And so I think where this kind of leaves us is kind of here, okay? Where it's like we're all walking on these paths going into these meadows, right? And you can almost kind of make out what's there. I mean, you can almost taste this stuff. It's so close, I swear to God. But we're not there, okay? We're just not there. And I can yell from here, and somebody over here can't even really hear me very well. And this is really the game, is to try to see, can we really work together to lift the mist and the fog and do something kind of different? And so in my case, what I'm trying to do is just stay connected to different people who are doing really cool stuff. Okay? Now, I told somebody that I was going to put my email address up here, and they said that was just insane. Okay? Because I already have real problems managing my email. But basically, what I've also done, as Tracy mentioned, was launched a blog, which I understand is kind of sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, so I got to fix that. But the basic idea is, instead of sending me emails, which I get sometimes from students saying, I'm doing a paper on X, can you help me find Y? In which case, I'll send an email back saying, go read the map. That's why we did the map. Have a good time. I'm interested in net impact, in this network. There are folks who are all over this stuff and these issues, who are basically learning about every single day, like the best way to think about this, or coming on an organization that's doing that, or are actually like housed within different institutions that are trying to grapple with various parts of that big picture issue. And none of us, I don't think, have the bandwidth to really appreciate or track the richness of experimentation and knowledge that actually is being brought forward. And so what I've been doing is just kind of connecting with folks through the blog and through the Blended Value website and just personally to try to really explore some of this stuff and track what's going on in a more effective way. Another example of that is this magazine that we're going to be launching at Davos in 2006 called Value. And this is just a mock-up. But the basic idea is to try to create a place in a magazine context where you can kind of represent this stuff out and where you can bring people together to talk about these crosscuts, not the silos, but the cross-cutting themes and issues. And you can really give us a platform for this. And the content for the magazine is going to be driven by a group of folks, probably 50 to 100 people initially, who will be brought together by John Elkington and myself to basically begin to explore how to drill down on these cross-cutting themes and how to really keep that kind of conversation and dialogue going. The other thing that's happening is, and one of the reasons I'm out here, is to create a capital mapping network. In the same way that I get tired of people using the blur word, if I hear one more person talk about the need to map the capital space so that we can understand how to connect this type of organization or institution with this type of capital, I'm just going to die, right? I mean, there's got to be like 7 of these things going on right now in different parts of the world. And so what we're basically proposing is, look, everybody just go ahead and do everything that you were going to do anyway, but let's just tell each other, like what's happening. And let's try to coordinate our stuff so that if I'm focused on emerging markets, venture capital here, how can I connect that with second and third tier kind of funding, which is more kind of the kind of blended value investing that I was presenting in my shtick. You've got folks who are involved in the World Economic Forum, the Bellagio Sustainable Development Forum, and one other group that escapes me right now, all 3 of which are launching these mapping initiatives. So we're going to try to pull some of those together. And again, the final part of that is the what else piece. Because at the end of the day, all of this is just moving so fast, and it's so incredible. And we need to be sharing that information more effectively and connecting better in that regard. So finally, I guess the closing thing would be just to say that I think it's really important that everybody build their organization, stay really grounded in what it is that you're called to do and how you understand that for where you are at any given point in time. And at the same time, I think it's really, really important that you do that work with your head way out here. Because if you really think that your organization that you're building is it, and that's the point, it's just wrong, right? I mean, I know teachers aren't supposed to say that, but I mean, it's just wrong. I mean, the whole point of doing any of this is to advance something else, bigger, more, better. Right? And if the legacy you leave are sets of institutions that help move that agenda, great. But the goal is not to create more institutions. Right? When I finished the mapping process, some of the people who had funded us said, you should create, the Blended Value Institute, so you can bring people together to talk about this, right? And I said, that's exactly what we should not do, right? Because you don't need another group to bring people together for more meetings to talk about the need to collaborate, right? It just doesn't make sense. So instead, what we need to do is have more people kind of pushing within their own organizations, institutions, to really build these links and connections, and to really have passion about the fact that that's what we're called to do. Right? Building the group is great. Developing the community is great, but it's the connecting function that really is going to get us where we need to go ultimately, and that's really the key thing. It's like George Marshall, who was the guy who did the Marshall Plan. Al uses this quote a lot, and I really like it. Basically, here's this guy at the end of World War II who's going around trying to convince all these people to put up a ton of cash to reinvest in Europe, right? And some of those conversations went well. A lot of them didn't, right? A lot of people were like, why should we do this? And he spent years just building momentum for that single idea. And one of his lines was to say to these folks, instead of steering ourselves by the ships to our side, we need to steer ourselves by the stars above. And that's all I'm asking for. So it's basically be connected to your institution, be connected to what you're called to do, but do it within a context of a greater vision about what this is all about. Because it's not about money, and it's not about social, and it's not about environmental. It's about maximizing the full value potential that each of us has to create through the course of our lives and through the work that we're called to do. So thank you very much. I appreciate your patience.